minute, man.
Much the invitation. And send my Shane Weigand.
Oh, why aren't we seeing the picture? Oh, this thing. Hi, Marion.
For always say yes anytime I ask you to do something.
But why no picture?
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Can send my Shane.
But it's not, that's not what I want. Not what I wanted. Let's see. Why in the world? Yeah. Let me try if I do it on here. You know, it was fine 5 minutes ago.
For always say yes anytime I ask you to do something.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Send my Shane.
Had it with this setup.
Central School District, one of the co-leaders of the Pathstone Foundation Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. I also serve on the boards of cities, community trust, and the communities of each way of the coalition. As well as the police department.
Something weird on mine.
And a lot of the work that we see here today comes out of those experiences.
As usual, I am struggling. Let's see. Connected. Okay. Yeah. Well, you could see it in here 10 minutes ago, and then I got here early and had it set up, and now you can't see it. So I don't know why. Yeah. Well. Well. world.
grams of protein in one meal with zero
Well,
cooking.
can you see the commercial? No, can't even see the commercial. All right.
Staying consistent was the hardest part. With factors, I can
Sorry, ladies, I thought I had it all set. I came early, got it all set, and... Is he? All right, I'm doing something dumb. Let me... Yeah, and the sound will come through, but I kind of want you to see the mix. Let me see if I can grab him real quick. Tiffany's calling for us. I bet it's something on my laptop. Yeah, exactly. All right, the only... I think so. Well, that one.
From always saying yes anytime I ask you to do something.
Still no picture. All right. Yeah, exactly. Picture in picture, full screen. All right. Well, I have one more idea, and then we'll just talk through some of it and listen. I just wish they'd make all the things the same, so that the buttons were always did the same thing, we're in the same place. Doesn't that seem like a good idea? All right. Well, not yet. I don't know if this is going to do anything, so. Okay. Now, I'm gonna sign in. Just telling my son the other day, you know, we're so used to these taking 2 seconds that if it takes 10, you're like, come on, and it's fast. It's just not instant. So 10 seconds is a lifetime. It's welcoming me, so that seems like a good sign. Well, while that's doing that, we can at least start the, we're here, it's February is, oh, here we go, wait. What you doing? There's our hero. Okay, Matt. It'll hear the sound, but it won't show the picture. And I'm guessing I've set something. It's showing the pretty picture, but not the.
No, it's showing your background. Everybody can hear me though, because this is set to extend as opposed to duplicate. So when I right-click and
Sure.
just choose Display Settings,
Yep, I knew it was going to be something like this. Okay.
and then instead of extend, say duplicate,
All right.
and then we'll hit keep.
Keep that, please.
So now they see what we see.
All right. Let's
And
go to
now
DuckDuckGo. Do we see what I see? Woo-hoo! Thank you, Matt. Round of applause. Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, really. Okay. So, apologies for that. So it's Black History Month, and it is the 100th official year of commemorating Black history in the United States. It was Gerald Ford who officially recognized Black History Month in 1976, calling on the public to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every endeavor throughout our history. Now, actually, Black History Month was the brainchild of a Harvard-trained African-American historian, Carter Woodson, and a prominent minister, Jesse Moorland. And they founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life in 1915. So it's been around a lot longer. We count it as 100 because, you know, a white man said that. Okay, so the month is a time to honor the contributions and legacy of African Americans and you know, the famous people, Harriet Tubman, you know, Frederick Douglass, so on, but also the lesser-known people, the people that were artists and mathematicians and speakers of all kinds. And I did find, you know, the library has great resources, our big public library, online and in person. And just, you know, read about somebody or read a novel by a black author or something like that. This year, obviously, when we have an administration that's taking down information about African Americans and their contributions and struggles, it's more important than ever to learn about their contributions. And we have a letter from Bishop Daniel Garcia, who's the chairman of the USCCB Subcommittee for the Promotion of Racial Justice and Reconciliation, and Bishop Roy Campbell, who's chairman of the Subcommittee on African American Affairs. And they wrote this beautiful letter. I printed off a few copies if anybody wants to grab one, called Treasures of Memory, a Reflection on Truth-Telling. And I'm just going to read you 2 short paragraphs from it because I think it's so timely. We must recommit ourselves to the sacred task of remembering, especially the stories of those whose voices have been long unheard. Sacred scripture and tradition offer a way forward for helping us understand why telling our stories is central to the gospel mandate. We must continue to tell those aspects of our national history, particularly those that recount the suffering of enslaved Africans, indigenous people, and other ethnic groups which have been marginalized. For Catholics, the telling and sharing of history is how we share experiences of God, community, and culture. And then later on in the letter, although we may at times encounter people or situations in our country that seek to erase memory from our minds and books, it can never be erased from our hearts. May our reflections strengthen our faith and communities. Let us be faithful stewards of memory. Let us be courageous witnesses to truth. Let us pray and work to honor the inherent dignity of every person and the sacred stories of every people. So it's a good letter, and like I said, very timely as we read about what's going on with kind of hiding and dismantling history. So all that said, today I wanted to do a little twist. It's like not so much the achievements of African Americans, but the history of racism in Rochester and how it's playing out even now. And so there are historical local figures in this who resisted, but also just what went on here. Why is there such a concentration of poverty and people of color in the urban areas and so forth? And what does that say about our housing situation and so forth? So this is a short talk by Shane Weigand. Some of you may know resistance mapping. He's a teacher and he's done mapping and curriculum for students and so forth, and also does a lot of outreach to communities about all sorts of community groups about, well, what went on? What's in your deed? Why are there, you know, what is the history that has shaped what Rochester looks like now? And it's kind of longish, it's 50 minutes, so I thought we'd break it into 2 parts. We'll watch the first half today, maybe have a little conversation. We can, you know, talk about what we've seen and experienced, and then come back next week. And now I know how to do that duplicate thing, so we'll get right on it next week. Okay. Yeah. That's hopefully just sleep mode. We got it? I'm going to make it full screen. Okay.
Kevin, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Kevin said, my name is Shane Weigand. I'm a 4th grade teacher in the Rush Henrietta Central School District. I'm one of the co-leaders of the Pat Stone Foundation Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. I also serve on the boards of St. Luke's Community Land Trust, Connected Communities, and Beechwood Neighborhood Coalition. as well as the Police Accountability Board Alliance. And a lot of the work that you're going to see here today comes out of those experiences with activism around housing and policing in the city of Rochester, as well as from my upbringing in the town of Webster. And most importantly, this whole talk was birthed 8 years ago when one of my 4th grade students asked me in January around Martin Luther King Week, as we learned about Dr. King and segregation in the South. The student asked me, Mr. Weigand, did this happen in Rochester? Did we have civil rights here? And I was flummoxed. I had no idea. Growing up in Webster, I grew up in a school where I never had a black teacher. I sat next to maybe 1, 2 students of color. And it never occurred to me that civil rights was something, or that racism was something that could be an issue here in our community. And when the student said that, it was like a light bulb went off. And I realized I grew up in a pretty segregated community, and I had no idea why. And so I said, I'm going to start looking into that. And I started learning about the Uprising of '64, about maybe the first Black Lives Matter protests in 1962, Reverend Gibson from Memorial AME, and Rufus Fairwell, who had been brutally beaten locking up his gas station in the Red Line Cornhill neighborhood, marched on City Hall demanding justice for Rufus Fairwell. And we'll talk more about that. But I started to research this stuff and got back to my student the next week. I learned about Dr. Walter Cooper, who faced housing discrimination. He was the first person of color to integrate Henrietta. And so many other things you'll learn about him tonight, as well as Dr. Holloway Young, who was the first black principal in the city school district, fought housing segregation, sexism, and so many other things in our community. Also, over these years, I started putting together a talk that I shared with adults and with other students, teachers. I've gotten to train over 200 teachers around the greater Rochester area. And this last year or so, the Passstone Foundation and Stuart Mitchell, we've been working together to raise funds, and we are most of the way funded to be able to offer free professional development around curriculum that's built on what you're going to hear today. I'm co-leading that project with the amazing Kelly McNair, who's an equity leader and principal in the Greece Central School District. And you can see those girls in the picture on the left. I'm going to talk more about their story as we go. But first, a few quick sources for this presentation. One of the most important is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Rothstein came to Rochester last summer. I helped bring him to the Passstone organization to Rochester. And he's actually looked through all these slides. He's found 2 small mistakes. I fixed both of them, 2 misspellings and a date. It was very upsetting. But this is the Rothstein-approved version. You're going to see a ton of images from the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle archives. The most fun thing, the New York State Commission on Discrimination from 1958. The Rochester Voices Project, as well as a whole bunch of interviews that I've done myself with these folks in our community who are honestly civil rights legends, heroes who have never stopped fighting this fight, and I hope that we'll be a part of that too. First though, before we get going, I think it's important to talk about some definitions. I love Ibram Kennedy's definitions, and we're going to use racism as a marriage of racist policies and ideas that reduce and normalize racial inequality. Your intentions and your good heart doesn't matter. For me, I got to college, it was the end of my freshman year, and I told a student of color that I was in class with, I said, I don't see your color. And it was a totally racist comment, and the student said to me, that's super racist, what are you talking about? You don't see my color, I'm a black person. And I was like, yeah, but like, I don't see color, man, like we're all the same. And they corrected me. I felt super defensive. I said, but my intentions are great. And that's being said, your intentions don't matter. What you said impacted me in a negative way. And it was something that was true. It fails to see how racism exists in these places. And that just, it was this paradigm shift for me. And that defensiveness, as I felt it, I had a choice. I could reject it, or I could embrace it and ask more questions. Do some of the hard work and learn about some of these things, which I think made it easier for me to answer that student's question. And it's one of those things I'm still working on. A racist policy, according to Kennedy, is a measure that reduces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups, whereas an anti-racist policy, what we're searching for, is any measure that reduces or sustains racial equity between racial groups, laws, rules, procedures, and even curriculums. Before we begin, though, I want to center us with a quote from one of my favorite books, White Fragility. In those moments when you feel defensive like I did, or where it feels a little bit overwhelming, and I love those group moments at the beginning, thank you. Remember this, she writes, the key to moving forward is what do we do with our discomfort? We can use it as a door out and blame the messenger, disregard the message, or use it as a door in by asking, why does this unsettle me, and what would it mean for me if this were true? So let's start with the good stuff. We come from an incredible community, the legacy of fighting for freedom, the Underground Railroad, and innovation. People like Frederick Douglass, who felt more at home here than anywhere else in the country. Folks like Austin Stewart, who were enslaved just down the road in Stuyvesant Bath, New York, who escaped and eventually opened the first black-owned business, the first black school, and a spot on the Underground Railroad right in downtown Rochester. Pittsburgh, Judge Ashley Sampson, a great leader in the Underground Railroad right here at the Hargis Briggs House. Of course, Susan B. Anthony, the famous suffragist and friend of Douglass, and the great innovator who solved huge technical problems in our world and made our world a better place. It's George Eastman, but also left a little bit more complicated legacy that we're going to explore a little bit later on. And part of that complicated legacy, and something that I think often we spend a lot less time on, is some of these hard facts that ACT Rochester in their 2017 report shares, saying that African American kids in the region are more than 4 times as likely than white children to live in poverty. 4 times. And that both African Americans and Latinos are less than half as likely to own their own homes as their white counterparts in our region. How do we get to a place like that? Well, when you look at our census map, you can see just incredible hyper-segregation. We have blue in our suburbs, and sea of green in our inner city. Blue dot meaning 1 white person, and 1 green dot meaning 1 black. I show this to 4th graders, and they always think this has to be 1950 or 1960. I show the same thing to high school students. They say the same thing, and when they realize it's pretty much today, there's shock, there's wonder, and there's this realization that we haven't, in our community, really given the context behind this map and how we got to a place where in New York, statewide, our schools are the most segregated out of all 50 states, and Edville recently found in 2020 the nation's most segregated school district border is the dividing line between Rochester and Penfield. We are number 1. When it comes to health, Common Ground Health has found that white privilege can literally mean life itself, up to 9 years. Because a child from Pittsburgh's 14534 zip code, well, they live over 9 years longer than a child from Rochester's 14608 zip code, that red line Plymouth Exchange cornhole neighborhood. We also have huge problems with wealth nationwide. In 2011, the median white household had a net worth of over $111,000 compared to only $7,000 for the median black household. So what do we do, right? We have this legacy of fighting for freedom with innovation, and yet we also have this current reality of just vast disparity. The central thesis of my talk today is really this quote from James Baldwin, who says that everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I want to invite you all today, facing some of these hard facts with me, and acknowledging that people of color have always faced these hard facts in our community, especially when white folks, the people in my family, my grandparents and great-parents, chose not to or directly participated in these things. So I got a quick thing in the chat. I gotta check here. I can't see that I will present. Give me 1 second. Hold on here. All right. So one of the first people that after Douglass and Stewart and folks like that is Howard Coles, editor of the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper, who really uncovered the red line in Rochester in 1938 when he unleashed his study on housing, finding that African Americans were being forced by real estate agents and banks into 2 neighborhoods of the city, the 7th and 3rd wards. And he found in those neighborhoods more than 30% of units didn't have running water. He found that there were damp cellars. In some places, like on Portland Avenue, less than half the homes where people of color lived, the landlords were not providing them with heat. Dr. Lunsford, the first black doctor in Rochester, faces head-on in the medical realm, challenging the University of Rochester Medical Center and Dean Whipple because they wouldn't allow people of color into their nursing or medical programs, and not for another 10 years. And Lunsford and Knox and many other leaders of color in our community fought and fought to get this, and eventually they did win. If you're not sure about that Whipple piece, whose name recently came down at the U of R because of some of this research, Whipple actually sent this form letter to any black applicant who applied, saying that they of course couldn't accept them in the medical program because during their clinical trainings, they would have to engage in obstetrics and be examining white women. Next, we have segregated nursery, things that Lunsford and Cooper and others would call out. In fact, the Journal of Medicine in Rochester found that the nursery at Strong was segregated into the early 1960s. Dr. Cooper's wife, Helen Cooper, found the same thing in 1953. Dr. Cooper says that he went over to Strong Hospital and found his wife in a segregated ward, separate but not equal. And as soon as he and his wife returned home, they vowed never to use Strong Hospital again. And when the son was born later, they chose to never, ever go back to Strong ever again. And there's a kind of thing in our community among many people of color, especially in some of those neighborhoods where Strong is a hospital that is still being avoided because of some of these stories. Anthony Jordan, the second black doctor in 42, did a huge study in conjunction with Howard Coles, finding in Rochester, the black death rate from all causes was 50% higher than that of whites, and tuberculosis in people of color was 2.5 times that of whites, and was directly linked to housing. So people of color face these things. They spoke out, they published in their own newspapers, in the DNC, they marched, they protested, and yet oftentimes they fell on deaf ears. And some of the things that they protested, some of the things I want to invite you to face with me today are the way racist policies experienced and realized themselves in the real estate industry, through restrictive and racial covenants, through redlining and VA and HA mortgages that came out of the 1934 National Housing Act and GI bills, urban renewal and exclusionary suburban zoning policy that exists in Pittsburgh, Penfield, and Fairport, and many other suburban towns today. Quick note, the context for today is a period of time called the Great Migration. From 1910 to 70, when millions of African Americans migrated from the South to the North, fleeing white domestic terrorism, Klan, white citizens councils, blacks with voting rights, landowning rights, and a whole host of other things. Oftentimes we think that people came here to work for places like Kodak or Bausch and Lomb, but actually the original big cohort of folks that came north came from Sanford, and they couldn't work at Kodak because they literally weren't allowed. And instead, they came to pick fruit in Rochester suburbs and rural areas. So, the first area we're going to face is the real estate industry. Meet Frank Drum, president of our real estate board, responsible for enforcing the National Real Estate Association Real Estate Board's Code of Ethics, which he did enforce. And for over 30 years, this code read that real should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character, property, or occupancy members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. A few slides back, you met Howard Coles, who actually knew about this, got his real estate license, and challenged it by showing people of color homes in white neighborhoods like the 19th Ward. Excuse me. Drum and his cronies actually made sure that Howard Coles was pushed out of the real estate industry, but any real estate agent who did this, the same fate they would met with. A few examples of how this played out. Dr. Walter Cooper, and I got a couple things in the chats. Oh, okay, thank you. All right, the Cooper said, Dr. Walter Cooper says, I then confronted housing segregation in Rochester. I was 54, and the wife and I entered ads for 69 apartments, and they were refused at all of them. One of those apartment owners was the Nico Farish Apartments, so they called the Farish Foundation. In 1957, Alice Young also faced this. A few years later, she actually went on to become the first black principal in the Rochester City School District. But a few years prior, she and her husband James, who were upper middle class, they went to the bank, and a single bank in town pre-approved them for a mortgage in the 19th Ward, which at the time was a 100% white neighborhood. No real estate agent would show her and her husband a home in those neighborhoods. But what they did is they reached out to a white friend, Harper Sibley, at the NAACP, the White Union Telegraph fortune, who actually gave them money and bought them a house in the 19th Ward on Milbank Street, sight unseen. The Youngs never got to go inside it. She bought them the house, did a private mortgage, and this is what the other 57 families in the 1950s and early 60s did when they bought their first house. Now, the next morning, Dawn and her husband woke up and found a note in the mailbox from the Ku Klux Klan in Milbank Street. It was incredibly offensive language, threatening them with life. They received threats for the next 17 years. I got to have lunch with Alice a few months ago before quarantine. She asked that when I tell her story, I include a white family across the street, the Bushes, who were the only family on their street who stood with them, protected them when the Klan came calling, or when neighbors would threaten them, and stood by their side and even helped them get the FBI involved in staying in their home, which they lived in for over 17 years. I don't often think of our area as Klan country. We often don't think about our area as Klan country, but in fact, this right here is a practice field for Eastern Rhonda schools. Their high school has their football practice field. It used to be John Ott's farm, and gatherings of 8,000 to 20,000 Klansmen, most years in the 20s, would gather here to celebrate white supremacy. Just some horrifying images right in the Democratic Chronicle. The next area, though, of racist policy is racial restrictive covenant. And we about like that white and black waterfront in the South, that really public symbol of segregation. Now, just as public, but less in your face symbol is a deed restriction. Whenever you buy a house, you get a deed, and there's a list of rules that are legal for how you can enjoy your house. Things that are great, like my neighbors not allowed to have a grain distillery in the backyard, which for me, I'm pretty grateful for that. And my next door neighbor, they can't have cows. Also something I'm pretty relieved by. But one of the things that was actually like the most popular thing across our county and nationwide was something called a racial restriction that said no person of color could live on that land. The man on the right was our first county manager in Monroe County, Clarence A. Smith, actually from Pittsburgh. And he and the county legislature sold lots of land. And on many of the tracts of land, especially on Bellamy, Thornton, Mindale, and the Newport Heights tract, they wrote racial restrictive covenants into those deeds. Connor Dwyer Reynolds at Yale Law School, he actually pulled these out of the clerk's office just last week, proving that the jury segregation was really happening, done by the county. You can see no persons other than of the Caucasian race shall ever use or occupy these lots, signed by the county manager over to the head of the Real Estate Association, Frank Drum. This happened all across our community. I'm going to get a little overkill on it. One place is Brighton, the Meadowbrook neighborhood. It was so carefully planned that Kodak started the Kodak Realty Corporation to buy this land, and the what are they called? The ESL Bank to finance these mortgages. Harry Haight wrote into every single one of the deeds that no lot or dwelling shall be sold to or occupied by a person of color. This is the whole Meadowbrook area, Bowenstill area, Coda Vista, Kodak right at it. And right along this same period, they had this hiring policy of not hiring people of color. Nor even did the 1939 New York State Temporary Commission on the Urban Population, finding that in Rochester, of the over 35,000 employees of private firms, only 70 were black, and that at Kodak, over 16,000 people, only one person was black and 0 were African American at Bausch and Lomb. This happened also at councils along the states of Brighton, where the DNC would advertise, look at the bottom left, rigid restrictions for the desirable social character of the homes. And you can see the photograph I took of the deed right there. Same in Pittsburgh. East Avenue Estates, developed by Grafton Johnson and General Realty. You can see these homes also advertised as being rigidly restricted, and the deed being right there. Fairport, East Rochester, Parrington, the Forest Hills neighborhood. Over 2,000 homes in West Toronto, including one of those homes, the founder of Wegmans, Walter E. Wegman, who on one of these 2,000 lots had this exact covenant. In the 1950s, even though they were legal, he made sure that the next buyer of his home kept that racial deed restriction on the land. The Forest Lawn Coronado Beach neighborhood in Webster, Dayton Corners, Penfield Manor in Penfield, Gates, you've got Norman Hoffman, the president of the Builders Association, over 250 homes right along Brooklyn Country Club. Gates Acres Gardens in 1939, actually the head of the Rochester Bar Association, Earl Case, he put these into all lots of acre gardens and gates. So this wasn't like some side thing that like a few kind of hardcore racists were doing. This was the county executive, this was the head of the Rochester Bar, the head of the Rochester Builders Association, and Frank Drum, the head of the National Real Estate Board, or the Rochester Real Estate Board. You can see here in Greece, the Dewey Stone Truck, Denise Road, Morley, even stipulated that Italians and black people couldn't live in those homes. Grace, Latona Homestead, same in Rochester, my neighborhood. I live in the Beechwood neighborhood, North Winton, Browncroft neighborhoods, and the 19th Ward. In fact, Judge Reuben Davis, the first black judge in Rochester, describes his experience facing these head-on. My wife and I were looking for a house. It was 1958. We saw a house that we liked on 135 Elmthorpe Ave in Rochester, just a block or so west of Genesee. Now, I'd say there were probably 4 black families that lived anywhere west of Genesee Street at that time. One of those families was Dr. L. No. The owner refused to sell to us because we were black. And there was a restrictive covenant in the deed that these houses were built were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians. Now, a lot of time, folks who are Italian and Jewish who are also discriminated by these deeds and by the FHA have said, you know, wow, like, we've had it just as bad. But it's important to note that in 1944, the GI Bill gets passed. And when the GI Bill gets passed in 44, Italians and Jewish folks are legally deemed white in the eyes of the federal government and are able to get VA and FHA mortgages to buy their homes, whereas black veterans returning from World War II and just any black individuals did not have that same access to those resources. Here are some of the places that I've found these covenants so far. And I want to say look on Wednesday or Thursday. City Roots Land Trust, of which I'm a member, as well as the Yale Law School, we'll be publishing a huge report on racial restrictive covenants and what we can do about them. It should be in a lot of news sources, so it's going to be incredible. Be excited. I've helped write it, and I'm beyond ecstatic about what it's going to do, I think, in our community. The next area of racist policy, though, is the New Deal, particularly the National Housing Act of 1934. This comes in the wake of the Great Depression. There's a huge housing crisis, and FDR, who's not from the South, and Senator Wagner, also not from the South, proud New Yorkers, they passed one of the most racist laws since slavery in our country, the National Housing Act, which creates the FHA mortgage. It creates the 30-year fixed interest rate mortgage with very little to no money down. And it was exclusively for white folks, because written into the FHA underwriting manual by Francis Babcock, who 24 was the man who invented race-based home assessment in Chicago, and was hired because of that race-based home assessment skill to come in and write the underwriting manual for how this law would be carried out. He said that if any neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. And the racist idea to justify a change in racial or social occupancy leads to instability or reduction in values, something which there was no evidence or research ever done to show that that was true. They also go on to mandate that deed restrictions, like the ones I just showed you in Rochester, should be imposed upon all land, prohibiting the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they're intended. Many of you may have heard of the Levitt towns. Almost 8% of the country's suburbs in the 40s and 50s were built by the Levitt brothers, all of which they built by using government financing to buy all the home building materials up front. They couldn't get those home building materials and those dollars unless they put these deed restrictions on there. In fact, they go even further, saying that highways and parks and rivers, they should be in place to separate black and white neighborhoods or inharmonious racial groups. And that brings you things like 490 and the inner loop. Now, we're looking at these federal policies, things brought by folks who oftentimes I think we thought of as kind of like northern liberals or the good guys. But Ibram Kennedy gives us a different way to think about this. In his masterwork, stamped from the beginning, saying, time and again, powerful, brilliant men and women have produced racist ideas like the ones you just saw in order to justify the racist policies of their era, like this policy to give white families the opportunity to buy homes and not black. He goes on to say, in the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, another way to think about it is the ultimate goal of racism is the profit and the comfort of the white race, specifically of rich white men, which includes myself and my father and both of my grandfathers. Both of my grandfathers in the 50s and 60s got 30-year FHA or VA mortgages with almost no money down to buy homes. One of my grandfathers, he was pretty poor, but he still was able to buy a home his first year of being in elementary school, sixth grade science teacher. He buys this tiny little home in Council Bluffs, Iowa, sells it, buys a much bigger home, uses that equity to send my parents and my uncles to college, helps send me to college. My dad moved to Rochester to work for Xerox with an engineering degree, and that wealth got passed down to where I'm standing before you today. I own a home in Beechwood. I don't have any debt but my mortgage. And when I've had mistakes like crashing my car when I first got out of college, my parents were able to drop me a couple $1,000s to help me pay for that so that I didn't go broke and didn't have to choose between paying rent and fixing my car so that I could get to work. And this is where that area of wealth being created by the government exclusively for one group of people like myself, it's so important to recognize that history, to own that, and to have that conversation in your community, and I think with your family. So how do we enforce racial segregation? This is where that term...
All right. This seemed like a good spot to stop, a little bit halfway through. So just curious, so what thoughts does that bring up for anybody? Was anybody, I was kind of surprised when I first saw it. Not that I didn't know those things went on here, but it was bigger than I thought. More systematic. I know my dad got a VA, one of those VA mortgages, and that's, same kind of story. Yeah.
It makes me question, what are we blind to now
Oh,
that, 30, 40, 50 years looking back, they'll say, how did they ever live with that?
yeah, and the way they kind of sugarcoat it with, I love the inharmonious mixing of the races, like it's just, well, we just understood that that wouldn't be good, wouldn't promote harmony. And I think they maybe thought some of that. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I didn't get the microphones. And when would that have been, roughly? Wow. Yeah, that's late 60s. Yeah, the riots were early 60s. Well, maybe it was starting to brew. Yeah, yeah. And props to them for, feeling that way. I don't think that was usual. Yeah. I can tell you that in the Monroe County where you record deeds, there are signs on the wall because so many deeds, most deeds, suburban deeds here, have those restrictive covenants. They're not enforceable anymore, and that's what the signs are on the wall where the deeds are recorded, so that people, if you see that, you don't think, oh gee, well, they're not enforceable, but they haven't gone through, you can't go through and take every single, they're not, some of them are still there. Yeah. Yeah.
So I listened to an episode of Connections during all of the past election season when our local officials were being elected, and the Pittsford town supervisor, who actually won re-election, was talking about affordable housing and was opposed to allowing duplex houses in Pittsford or having affordable housing units designated in new developments because he didn't want us to turn into someplace like East Rochester.
Horrors. Yeah, he's going to get to that a little bit, but that's the new way is those restrictive covenants are no longer enforceable, but zoning. They use zoning. Well, you have to have at least an acre lot, or the house has to have at least 5 bedrooms, and that's been very prevalent in towns like Pittsford, Penfield, the P-towns, towns in Greece, so that you can control it without saying anything about race, but making it so nobody beneath a certain, and I think he's going to get to, he's talked a little about just the wealth disparity. Where do the people making more or less than $75,000 live as a family unit? So there are hardly any poor people outside the city. Yeah.
I'm not remembering all the details of this, but last year or the year before, as part of a history program in Brighton, the students went to get the deeds for the town and found all of the redlining language in there, and they were able to get some of that out of the deeds by pressuring that and saying, this is not who we are. So that's a very positive thing that happened in Brighton that's bringing the current generation of kids to an awareness of a systemic racism that is so prevalent and that is around us all this time. But hooray for them that they were able to do that.
That's fantastic. Because I think it's important that we don't just put a sign on the wall saying these aren't enforceable, but that they actually be removed. And it's not expensive or complicated to do that, but it takes effort and awareness. I think what Elaine said about you have to see it first and think about, well, what does that imply? Because it's the restrictive covenants, but also the redlining. You can't get a mortgage. You can't, so I have had people in my own family say, well, why are they all, why are they poor in the city? Must be they don't work hard or whatever the list of, and it's like, no, it's this. Yeah. What else?
This is just sort of an observation, but in this 1960, I taught in the 19th Ward in a St. Monica's, and it was completely white. 20 years later, in 1980, I taught there again, and it was completely black. So that's how fast the turnover was in that, and that was a big school, But so maybe it can go the other way just as fast.
Yeah.
Wouldn't we hope?
Yeah, that's amazing. Who would have thought that?
I know it.
Yeah.
I never even put the connection together with how fast that happened before.
Here comes Elaine. No, that's good.
I was surprised to hear about the Jewish people and the Italian people also had a hard time.
Yeah. Yeah. Weren't white until 1944? Is that what he said? Wow. Yeah.
White Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Yeah.
That's the prize.
That's right. That's right. So it's interesting to think about, and I think it's a hidden element of our own community, the way in which this has played out and continues to play out because of these zoning restrictions. So that's the tool now. And I think he gets into that further, but it's hidden in plain sight, I guess, if you're a white person. Yeah, and it is uncomfortable.
And I think out of my own experience, even the, quote, most Christian people in the world were still afraid of the people moving into their neighborhood who would bring the neighborhood down.
Yes.
And wherever that came from, that perception, it was almost like ingrained in them that once this starts,
yeah,
the whole neighborhood will go down.
Yeah. And it won't just be integrated, it'll go down. Your property values will drop because of those people, whoever that might be. Yeah. I, again, remember in my own family those conversations. Yeah. It's sort of a vicious circle for the people who are those people. You can't, if you move to the suburbs trying to get away from the congestion of the city or trouble in the city or whatever, you're bringing down the neighborhood. There's no path. Yeah.
In the 50s, our neighbor across the street, I grew up in Greece, small, middle-class houses, Kodak. And the neighbor across the street had to move out real quick. She was trying to sell the house. And I think my father was interested, I don't know. But a black family came and looked at it. And he bought it right away. Mm-hmm. My father. Mm-hmm. And I knew that, and it just broke my heart. But the interesting thing is it's a family thing, because I know my grandmother, the sweetest woman in the world, had that feeling. And she didn't like, although one of the priests brought a black priest to to the house for dinner one time, and that was okay because Father Elmer McNamara brought him, so he had to be okay. But she was afraid, I think, of black people. But do you know what? When she was dying, her nurse was the dearest black person she ever met, and she learned to love her. So isn't God good?
Mm-hmm.
So she went to heaven loving black people.
That's beautiful.
And I wonder how much of that was just we didn't have those situations where we crossed paths with them, because they weren't in our neighborhoods, they weren't in our churches, they weren't in our schools. So the foreign, the strange, is always kind of fearsome, until you get to know an individual. That brings some of the barriers down. I had to laugh at a comment made by someone you'll all appreciate and know, that no one understood what was sung at the Super Bowl at the halftime show, and I thought the whole Spanish community understood every word of it, although it was a little hard to get it hearing-wise, but I thought, how can you say no one understood anything?
I think one of the tragedies of whites and blacks segregated into neighborhoods by whatever means is that we aren't able to have those relationships that open up to us the other's history, the other's experience, the other's form of spirituality. And so it is a poverty. It is a certain poverty that we expose ourselves to when we do not have that experience.
And that makes it easier for us to swallow the story, right? I think of TV in the 60s and 70s, and the people of color were always criminals, pimps and prostitutes and drug dealers, and the news would kind of play that up. And so if you aren't in contact, and I think, honestly, there's echoes of that today, where we're in our own silos, and the algorithm tells you only the things that you agree with. But this whole thing of it's easier if you haven't you don't know anybody, to be like, well, they are like that, and to be afraid. Any other? So we'll do the other. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
We wonder what do we, the quote, white people of this generation, what do we do about that other than try to form our own groups where there are people of mixed races, and where there is a chance to have real conversations about the other's experience? Is there a restorative sort of justice for an entire, for the sin of racism? Is there?
There is a state government committee. I think it's a volunteer committee, and the president of Urban League, or the executive director, is the head of it, that is considering what would that look like, what would restitution be, what would we need to do to make it right. People really resist that, but at least they're considering it. I don't know, it's certainly not on the horizon as an immediate thing, but at least they're considering it and talking about it and speaking out about it and so forth.
I think Pachi Benny they've been putting, this organization has been putting out nonviolent practices that they've discovered around the world that counter the violence. And it seems to me the other day they had something about a community, and I don't remember where, and you could, maybe through your taxes, I'm not sure, contribute voluntarily to a fund geared towards restitution for what has been done to African Americans. And I don't know exactly how it worked, but I think in our government, I think you can contribute to something like environment or something. I think there's sometimes on a tax form where you can make like a dollar contribution or something to some cause. And, you know, I wonder if that would be something on city taxes or something to make a voluntary, and then I don't know where it would go exactly, but to something.
I'll look into that. Maybe that's available. I know there's this land justice futures that used to be nuns and nuns, and they would meet with religious communities that were interested in exploring whether to give their land back to Native American people or whatever. But they also, I think, have donations. So maybe that's a thing to think about, to look into. I have a handout that he had. He did a presentation for the what's that thing? The Historical Society, basically. And so he had some good. I only printed one because it was long, but we could sign it out and pass it around if anybody's interested. And then I have a few copies of that letter that the bishops wrote about memory. And what else would be helpful? There are books in the Justice office. I think I'm 2608. I'm on the second floor. You'll find me if you go to where the offices are. I have a little library in there that you could sign out, books about, white fragility and those kinds of things if anybody's interested in reading more too. Is one thing we can do is to inform ourselves, I think. So, other comments or questions? Or is it uncomfortable it sounds like many of you kind of knew this, but the reality of it is a little uncomfortable when you feel like I'm a good anti-racist, and then you realize, oh my gosh, how much more structural was it than I ever knew? Yeah. All right. Well, come back for part 2, please. And like I said, now I know which button to push on the bottom so we don't have that lag. All right, thank you so much. And here's the... It's got all the maps and stuff and the pictures from the DNC. It's pretty cool.
Because you volunteered to keep that downstairs bulletin board neat and tidy.